They told me you didn't want me. The words echoed in her mind as another stranger walked past, eyes deliberately avoiding hers. Your mother gave you up because she couldn't be bothered. Welcome back, and tell me what city you're watching from, or what time it is where you are. Enjoy this story that might just change how you see the world. The corner of Fifth Avenue and Madison Street in downtown Chicago had become Helen Morrison's entire universe. Every morning at 6:47 a.m., she would position herself against the cold brick wall of the First National Bank, her weathered cardboard sign propped carefully against her knees. Homeless. Anything helps. God bless. The words had faded from months of rain and snow, just like everything else in her life. Helen's fingers, gnarled from arthritis and purple from the November cold, clutched a paper coffee cup that hadn't held actual coffee in weeks. The cup was her lifeline, a prop that made her seem less threatening to the stream of business people who flooded this corner twice daily, rushing to and from their important lives in glass towers that scraped the Chicago sky. Her coat, once navy blue, now hung in tatters around her 73-year-old frame. It had been donated by a church volunteer who'd looked at Helen with a mixture of pity and discomfort, the way people look at problems they can't solve and don't want to think about too deeply. The coat was 3 sizes too large, making Helen appear even smaller than her 5'2" frame, like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes that would never fit properly. She had learned the rhythm of this corner by heart. The morning rush brought investment bankers and lawyers, their Italian leather shoes clicking against concrete, with the urgency of people who measured success in milliseconds. They clutched their phones like religious artifacts, speaking in coded languages about mergers and acquisitions, never once glancing down at the woman whose entire day's survival depended on their spare change. At 8:15 a.m., the real estate executive would emerge from the Starbucks across the street, his $6 coffee steaming in the crisp air. He would walk within 3 feet of Helen every single day, talking loudly into his Bluetooth headset about multi-million-dollar properties, while stepping over her outstretched legs as if she were just another piece of urban debris. By 9 a.m. the sidewalk would clear, leaving Helen alone with the pigeons and the occasional tourist who would photograph the impressive bank building behind her, sometimes accidentally capturing her in the frame, an unintended reminder that poverty existed even in America's most prosperous neighborhoods. Helen had been invisible for so long that she sometimes wondered if she had actually died and was haunting this corner, doomed to watch a world that had forgotten she existed. The thought wasn't entirely unwelcome. Being dead might explain why her pleas for help seemed to pass through people like sound waves through empty air. But today felt different. Today, something in the air carried a weight that made her chest tight with anticipation she couldn't name. Maybe it was the way the morning fog clung to the street longer than usual, or how the pigeons seemed more restless, pacing back and forth as if they too sensed change coming. Helen reached into her coat pocket and touched the photograph she'd kept for 32 years, a picture so worn the faces were barely recognizable, a young woman with bright eyes, holding a baby boy with a tuft of golden hair. The woman was her, though sometimes Helen couldn't remember being that person. The baby was Jason, though she'd only known him for 6 precious weeks before they took him away. "You're unfit," the social worker had said, her voice clinical and final. "A widow with no income, no family support, no stable housing. The baby deserves better than what you can provide." They'd made her sign papers while she was still weak from childbirth, still grieving her husband's sudden death in a construction accident that had shattered her world 3 days before Jason was born. She'd fought them with everything she had, which wasn't much. 19 years old, alone, penniless, and drowning in a system designed to help families like the Andersons, the wealthy couple who wanted to adopt Jason. They had a mansion in Lincoln Park, trust funds, connections. They could give him private schools, European vacations, opportunities that Helen's grocery store clerk's salary could never provide. "Think about what's best for him," they'd said. "Don't let your selfishness ruin his future." So she'd signed the papers, believing she was saving him from a life of struggle like hers. She'd signed away her son, her heart, her reason for breathing. They'd promised she could see him when he turned 18 if he wanted contact. They'd lied about that too. For 32 years, Helen had searched faces in crowds, wondering if every young man with blonde hair might be her Jason. She'd written letters to the adoption agency that went unanswered. She'd called until they changed their number. She'd shown up at their office until security escorted her away, with warnings about harassment charges. The years had not been kind. Without Jason to fight for, Helen had drifted from job to job, city to city, relationship to relationship, all of them ending the same way, with her alone again. The drinking started as a way to sleep through the pain. The drinking led to missed work. Missed work led to evictions. Evictions led to shelters. Shelters led to the streets. Now at 73, Helen had been homeless for 4 years. 4 years of sleeping in doorways, eating from dumpsters, begging for coins from people who earned more in an hour than she'd seen in months. 4 years of being treated like a stain on the fabric of polite society, something to be stepped around and ignored until someone else dealt with the problem. A woman in an expensive pantsuit approached, her heels announcing her importance with every step. Helen looked up hopefully, managing a small smile despite her chapped lips and missing teeth. "Excuse me, ma'am." The woman's face twisted in disgust as she quickened her pace, pressing her purse closer to her body as if poverty might be contagious. "Don't touch me," she hissed, though Helen hadn't moved from her position against the wall. Helen's smile faltered. She pulled her knees closer to her chest, making herself smaller, less threatening. "God bless you anyway," she whispered to the woman's retreating figure, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. This was her life now. This corner, this cup, this cardboard sign that proclaimed her failure to a world that had already decided she didn't matter. Every morning she woke up hoping today might be different, and every night she curled up in whatever doorway felt safest, knowing tomorrow would bring more of the same. But as the morning fog began to lift, and the Chicago skyline emerged in sharp relief against the November sky, Helen Morrison had no idea that everything she thought she knew about her life was about to shatter like glass hitting concrete. She had no idea that across town, a successful businessman was staring at the same photograph she carried, wondering how to find the mother he'd been told didn't want him. Change was coming to the corner of 5th and Madison. Change that would arrive in the form of screeching tires, expensive suits, and words that would echo through her heart like thunder. "Mom?" Helen's fingers traced the rim of her empty coffee cup as memories flooded back like water through a broken dam. Before this corner became her world, she had been someone else entirely, someone who mattered. In the years immediately after losing Jason, Helen had thrown herself into helping others, as if caring for other people's children could somehow fill the crater in her chest. She'd worked double shifts at Sacred Heart Children's Hospital, mopping floors and sanitizing rooms where mothers held their babies close. The privilege she'd been denied. "Helen, you're an angel," Nurse Patricia used to say, watching her clean the pediatric ward with extra care. "You make this place shine." Helen would smile and continue scrubbing, secretly hoping that if she worked hard enough, served faithfully enough, maybe God would bring Jason back to her somehow. She remembered Mrs. Chen in room 314, whose premature twins fought for life in the NICU. Helen would slip Mrs. Chen extra blankets during those cold nights when the worried mother refused to leave the hospital. She'd bring her coffee and toast from the cafeteria, using her own meal vouchers because she couldn't bear to see another mother suffer. "You don't have to do this," Mrs. Chen had whispered through tears one night. "You barely know us." "Every mother deserves someone in her corner," Helen had replied, adjusting the uncomfortable chair where Mrs. Chen had been sleeping for weeks. What she didn't say was that helping her felt like the closest thing to being a mother Helen would ever experience again. For 15 years, Helen had been the hospital's most dedicated custodian. She knew every doctor's coffee preference, every nurse's birthday, every family's story. She'd held vigil with parents during surgeries, celebrated with families when children went home healthy, and wept silently in supply closets when the outcomes weren't happy. Dr. Martinez, the chief pediatrician, had grown particularly fond of Helen. "You should have been a nurse," he'd tell her sometimes. "You have the heart for it." But Helen knew better. Her life had taken a different path, one that led through loss and sacrifice rather than professional achievement. She'd lived in a tiny studio apartment 6 blocks from the hospital, walking to work every day, regardless of weather. The apartment was sparse. A bed, a small table, 1 chair, and a hot plate for cooking simple meals. But it was clean, it was hers, and hanging above her bed was a small frame containing Jason's baby picture, the only photograph she had from their 6 weeks together. Every penny Helen earned beyond survival went into a savings account she'd opened in Jason's name. She dreamed that someday, when he turned 18 and could legally seek her out, she'd have something to offer him. Not much, but evidence that she'd never stopped thinking about him, never stopped preparing for his return. "Where's your family for Thanksgiving?" co-workers would ask during holiday shifts. Helen would smile and make excuses about visiting relatives in other states, then spend the holiday cleaning empty hospital hallways, grateful for the overtime pay that meant more money for Jason's account and less time alone with her thoughts. She celebrated Christmas by volunteering to work double shifts, allowing colleagues with children to stay home. She'd decorate the pediatric ward with special care, hanging lights and setting up a small tree in the family lounge. Watching children open gifts from hospital staff and volunteers was both heartbreaking and healing, a reminder of what she'd lost and what she still had to give. The other custodial staff respected Helen, though they didn't understand her. "You work too hard," Maria from the night shift would say. "Take vacation days, date someone, live a little." But Helen couldn't explain that work was her prayer, that serving others was the only way she knew to honor the love she couldn't give her son. The hospital administration noticed her dedication too. 3 times over 15 years, they offered her promotions to supervisory positions. Each time, Helen politely declined. She didn't want authority or recognition. She wanted to remain close to the children, close to the families, close to the life she might have had. Then came the budget cuts. Healthcare systems across the country were streamlining operations, which meant eliminating positions held by people like Helen, dedicated employees whose work was essential but whose formal education made them expendable. The day they called her into the administrative office, Helen knew what was coming. She'd seen the younger custodians getting nervous, heard whispers about right-sizing and efficiency improvements, but after 15 years of perfect attendance, of working holidays and overtime, of treating the hospital like her second home, she'd somehow believed she was safe. "We're restructuring the custodial department," Mr. Peterson, the facilities manager, had explained without meeting her eyes. "Your position is being eliminated. We'll be contracting with an outside cleaning service." He slid an envelope across the desk. 2 weeks severance. "You can finish out the week." Helen stared at the envelope, her hands trembling. Is it something I did wrong? I can work harder. I can take on extra duties. This isn't about performance, Helen. You've been exemplary. It's just business. Just business. 15 years of her life, of caring for sick children and supporting grieving families, reduced to just business. Helen took the envelope with as much dignity as she could muster. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said, her voice barely audible. Cleaning out her small locker felt like dismantling a shrine. Her spare uniform, the family photos co-workers had shared with her over the years, a coffee mug Dr. Martinez had given her one Christmas with "World's Best Hospital Angel" printed on the side. All of it fit into a single plastic bag. The pediatric staff threw her a small goodbye party in the break room, cake from the hospital cafeteria, weak coffee, and awkward speeches about how much she'd meant to everyone. Helen smiled and thanked them, but inside she felt like she was dying again, the same hollow ache she'd experienced when they took Jason away. "Keep in touch," Nurse Patricia said, hugging her goodbye. "Let us know how you're doing." Helen nodded, knowing she never would. How could she explain to these successful, settled people that without this place she had nowhere to go, that her entire identity had been built around serving others, and without that purpose, she didn't know who she was supposed to be? The jobs that followed were a steady descent into invisibility, cleaning office buildings at night, where she became a ghost, moving through empty cubicles while the real world slept. Stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery store, where customers looked through her like she was part of the fixtures. Each position paid less than the last, required fewer skills, offered less dignity. "You're lucky we even let someone your age work here," the grocery store manager had said during her 6-month review. "Most places won't hire people past 55. Helen was 62 at the time, but she nodded gratefully, afraid to correct him, afraid to seem ungrateful for the minimum wage job that barely covered her rent. The final blow came when the grocery store chain was bought by a larger corporation. Restructuring, they called it. Bringing in our own team. Helen and a dozen other long-time employees were let go on the same day, replaced by younger workers who would accept even lower wages. At 68, Helen discovered what millions of older Americans learned too late, that experience and loyalty mean nothing in an economy that values youth and disposability over wisdom and dedication. Job applications went unanswered. Interviews, when she could get them, ended with polite rejections and unspoken age discrimination. The savings account she'd maintained for Jason dwindled as she used it to pay rent, buy food, keep her phone connected in case he ever tried to call. She moved to smaller apartments, cheaper neighborhoods, until finally there were no apartments she could afford at all. The first night Helen slept in her car, she cried until dawn. By the 10th night, she was too tired to cry. By the 20th night, sleeping sitting up had become normal. When the car was repossessed for missed payments, the transition to doorways and park benches felt inevitable rather than shocking. She wondered for the first time, was I always just background to their lives? The question haunted her as she settled into her spot on the corner each morning. All those years of caring, of serving, of sacrificing, had any of it mattered? Or had she simply been invisible labor, noticed only when absent, appreciated only in retrospect? The photograph in her pocket grew more fragile with each passing day, edges soft from constant touching. Sometimes Helen would hold it up to catch the morning light, studying Jason's infant face, as if she could will him to remember her love, to somehow know that everything she'd done since losing him had been for him, had been an attempt to become worthy of the second chance she prayed would come. But as another day of being ignored began on the corner of 5th and Madison, Helen Morrison had no way of knowing that her son had never stopped looking for her either. The humiliation began with the police officer's flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, striking Helen's face like an accusation. She'd been sleeping against the back wall of Mercy General Hospital, the same hospital where she'd once been called an angel, where families had trusted her with their most precious moments. "Move along, lady. You can't sleep here." Officer Bradley's voice carried the weary authority of someone who'd had this conversation 100 times before. Helen blinked awake, disoriented, her arthritic joints screaming as she struggled to sit up. "I'm sorry, officer, I don't care what you were just doing. This is private property. Hospital administration called it in." He stood over her, his uniform pressed and clean, representing a world of order and belonging that Helen had been exiled from. "There's a shelter on Roosevelt Street. Go there." Helen knew about the Roosevelt Street shelter. She also knew it had been full for 3 months, with a waiting list longer than the Chicago River. But explaining that to Officer Bradley would only waste both their time and possibly earn her a citation she couldn't afford to pay. She gathered her few possessions, a plastic bag containing a spare shirt, a water bottle with a crack down one side, and the photograph that never left her, and shuffled away into the October cold. Behind her, the hospital glowed with warm light, its windows revealing the busy life continuing inside. Nurses walking hallways she'd once cleaned, doctors making rounds she'd once supported, families finding comfort in spaces she'd helped maintain. Now she was banned from even sleeping near it. The worst part wasn't the cold or the hunger or even the constant fear. The worst part was how completely she'd disappeared from human consideration. Helen had become what sociologists called the invisible poor, so far outside normal society that people's brains simply edited her out of their visual field. She discovered this phenomenon most acutely during the lunch rush at Grant Park. Every day at noon, office workers would flood the small green space, claiming benches and patches of grass for their brief escape from corporate towers. Helen would sit on the far end of a bench, careful not to take up more than her share of space, watching the city's successful people live their lives around her. The conversations she overheard were like windows into an alien world. The contractor wants an extra $50,000 for the kitchen renovation. Private school tuition went up again, $15,000 per semester now. We're thinking about the Maldives for Christmas vacation. These were the descendants of problems Helen couldn't even imagine having. People worried about which expensive option to choose, while she calculated whether she had enough energy to walk to the public library before it closed, where she could use the restroom and sit in warmth for a few hours. One particularly cruel afternoon, a group of young businessmen settled onto her bench during their lunch break. They spread out their takeout containers from an upscale restaurant, containers that probably cost more than Helen had seen in weeks, and began discussing their weekend plans. "The new guy in accounting seems decent," one said, unwrapping what smelled like gourmet sandwich. "Maybe we should invite him to Happy Hour Friday." "Definitely," another agreed. "It's important to include people, you know. Nobody should feel invisible." They talked about inclusion and community, while literally sitting 18 inches from a human being they couldn't see. Helen remained perfectly still, afraid that movement might remind them of her existence and force them to confront the awkwardness of their situation. When they finished eating, one of them stood to throw away his trash and nearly stepped on Helen's foot. He glanced down, startled, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly materialized. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Helen managed a small apologetic smile, the kind of expression that said, "I'm sorry for existing in your space." The man looked away quickly, visibly uncomfortable, and hurried to rejoin his friends. As they walked away, Helen heard him say, "God, we should probably find a different spot for lunch. This park is getting sketchy." Sketchy. Her presence made the park sketchy. Not dangerous. She was a 73-year-old woman who weighed 98 pounds and hadn't raised her voice in years. Just unpleasant to look at. An aesthetic problem to be avoided. The library became Helen's sanctuary, not just for shelter, but for the illusion of dignity it provided. At the Newbury Library on Walton Street, she could sit among students and researchers, and for a few hours, pretend she belonged to the community of people who valued knowledge and quiet contemplation. She'd choose a table in the back corner of the reading room and carefully arrange herself to look purposeful. Sometimes she'd pull out a discarded newspaper someone had left behind and read every word, including the classified ads for jobs she'd never qualify for and apartments she'd never afford. Other times she'd simply sit with her eyes closed, listening to the soft sounds of pages turning and keyboards clicking, the soundtrack of lives that still had direction and hope. But even there, her otherness became apparent in small, cutting ways. The security guard, a kind-faced man named Marcus, would check on her more frequently than he checked on others. Not aggressively, but with the gentle persistence of someone managing a potential problem. "You doing okay today, Miss Helen?" he'd ask, his voice low and respectful. She appreciated his kindness, but she also understood the subtext. He was making sure she wasn't planning to sleep there, wasn't disrupting the real patrons, wasn't crossing the invisible line between tolerated visitor and unwelcome vagrant. The morning she tried to clean herself in the library restroom became a masterclass in public humiliation, disguised as policy enforcement. Helen had risen early to use the facilities before the building got busy, carefully washing her face and hands in the sink, trying to make herself presentable for another day of seeking work or assistance. A well-dressed woman entered the restroom and stopped short at the sight of Helen bent over the sink, using paper towels to clean beneath her arms. The woman's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disgust, fear, before settling on the kind of righteous indignation that transforms personal discomfort into moral crusade. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice sharp with authority. "This is a restroom, not a bathing facility." Helen straightened slowly, water still dripping from her chin. "I'm sorry, this is inappropriate. There are facilities for people like you." The woman pulled out her phone with theatrical purpose. "I'm calling security. People like you." Helen felt the words hit her chest like physical blows. She gathered her plastic bag and backed toward the door, mumbling apologies to a woman who was already speaking to someone in security about a vagrant situation in the women's restroom. Marcus arrived within minutes, his face pained but resolute. "Miss Helen, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave for today. You can come back tomorrow, but you can't use the restrooms for washing." "I understand," Helen whispered, though she didn't understand at all. She didn't understand how basic human hygiene had become a privilege she wasn't entitled to. She didn't understand how trying to maintain dignity had become a violation of social order. As she walked past the information desk toward the exit, she heard the librarian explaining the situation to a colleague. "We try to be accommodating, but we have to think about our regular patrons' comfort level. It's not that we don't sympathize, but there are proper channels for homeless services." Proper channels. As if Helen hadn't spent months learning that the proper channels were overwhelmed, underfunded, and designed to help people who fit neat categories rather than 73-year-old women who'd fallen through every available crack in the social safety net. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, outside the Roosevelt Street Community Center, where Helen waited in line for the free lunch program. She'd arrived at 9 a.m. for a meal that wouldn't be served until noon, joining the queue of Chicago's forgotten people, who marked time by the rhythm of charitable food distribution. A news crew had come to film a story about holiday giving, their bright lights and professional equipment drawing curious crowds of passers-by. The reporter, a young woman with perfect hair and expensive clothes, interviewed the center's director about their mission and impact. "We serve over 200 meals a day to our city's most vulnerable residents," the director explained, his voice carrying the practiced compassion of someone who'd given this speech many times. "Everyone deserves dignity and nourishment, regardless of their circumstances." The reporter nodded sympathetically, then turned to scan the line of people waiting for food. Her eyes settled on Helen, perhaps because she was older than most of the others, perhaps because she still carried herself with a posture that suggested she hadn't always been here. "Excuse me," the reporter said, approaching with her cameraman in tow. "Would you be willing to talk about your experience, about what brought you here?" Helen panicked. The last thing she wanted was to be seen on television as the face of homelessness, to become a cautionary tale or object of pity for people watching the evening news. "No, please, I don't want—" But the camera was already rolling, the reporter already introducing her segment. "We're here with Helen, who represents the often overlooked population of elderly homeless women in Chicago." "Please don't," Helen said, turning away from the camera. "I don't want my picture," the reporter persisted, following Helen as she tried to retreat from the line. "Can you tell us how long you've been without housing? What services would help you most?" Other people in line began to stare. Some looked sympathetic, others annoyed that the media attention might disrupt their lunch routine. Helen felt exposed, stripped of what little privacy and dignity she had left. She was becoming a spectacle, a poverty exhibit for viewers to consume with their morning coffee. "My son," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "If my son is watching, I don't want him to see me like this." The cameraman lowered his equipment, finally registering her distress. The reporter's expression softened with what might have been genuine compassion or merely professional disappointment at losing a good interview subject. "I'm sorry," the reporter said. "We didn't mean to upset you, but the damage was done." Helen left the line without getting lunch, walking aimlessly through downtown Chicago, while tears froze on her cheeks. Somewhere out there, Jason was living his life, successful, surrounded by people who valued him, probably never imagining that his mother was begging for food and sleeping in doorways. The photograph in her pocket felt heavier that day, like evidence of a crime she'd committed against them both. She pulled it out as she settled into a doorway for the night, studying Jason's infant face in the glow of a streetlight. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the faded image. "I tried to be someone you could be proud of. I tried to be worthy of finding you again." But as she tucked the photograph away and pulled her inadequate coat tighter against the November wind, Helen Morrison didn't know that across the city, a successful businessman named Jason Foster was holding an identical photograph and making plans that would change both their lives forever. The morning that would change everything started with cruelty disguised as charity. Helen had been sitting on her usual corner when a group of college students approached, their designer backpacks and matching Northwestern University sweatshirts marking them as visitors to the downtown area. "Oh my God, look at her," one of the girls whispered loudly enough for Helen to hear. "She's like ancient. How sad is that?" The group's leader, a blonde girl with perfectly straightened hair and manicured nails, pulled out her phone. "This would be perfect for my social media project on urban poverty. Professor Martinez said we need to document real social issues." Helen instinctively raised her hand to shield her face, but the girl was already positioning herself for a selfie, using Helen's misery as a backdrop for her academic assignment. "Don't move, okay? I need the lighting to be right. Please," Helen said quietly. "I don't want my picture taken." "It's for a good cause," the girl insisted, snapping several photos despite Helen's protests. "I'm raising awareness about homelessness. This could help you." One of the boys in the group pulled out a $20 bill and dropped it in Helen's cup with theatrical flourish. "There you go, Grandma. Buy yourself something nice." His friends laughed as if he'd made a brilliant joke. As they walked away, Helen heard the blonde girl explaining to her friends, "I'm going to write about how homelessness affects the elderly. It'll probably get like 1 million views. Professor Martinez loves when we engage with real social problems." Helen stared at the $20 bill, more money than she'd seen in weeks, and felt sick. She'd become content for someone's school project, a prop in a performance of caring that had nothing to do with her actual humanity. The money felt contaminated, earned through her humiliation rather than given with genuine compassion. But then Maria appeared. Maria Santos was 64 years old, 4'11" tall, and worked as a housekeeper for some of Chicago's wealthiest families. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she caught the bus at the corner where Helen sat, traveling from her small apartment in Pilsen to the Gold Coast mansions, where she cleaned bathrooms and organized closets for people who earned more in a day than she made in a year. Unlike everyone else who passed Helen's corner, Maria saw her, really saw her. "Mija," Maria said the first time she stopped, using the Spanish endearment that meant, "my daughter. How long since you eat something real?" Helen looked up, startled by the directness of the question. Most people who acknowledged her existence at all spoke in abstractions, asking about her situation or offering generic wishes for her to stay safe. Maria asked about food like a mother asking her child about dinner. Yesterday, I think, someone gave me half a sandwich. Maria shook her head with the disapproval of someone who understood hunger intimately. From her worn purse, she pulled out a container still warm from her morning cooking. Arroz con pollo. I make extra for my grandson, but he didn't come by yesterday. The food was a revelation. Real chicken, seasoned rice, beans cooked with care and attention. Helen ate with tears streaming down her face, not just from gratitude but from the forgotten pleasure of a meal prepared with love rather than industrial efficiency. "What's your name, Mija?" Maria asked, settling onto the sidewalk beside Helen despite her own clean work uniform. Helen Morrison. I'm Maria Santos. And you're not just homeless, are you? You're someone's mother. The observation hit Helen like lightning. After years of being reduced to her circumstances, the homeless woman, the vagrant, the problem, someone had recognized the core of her identity. "How did you know?" Maria smiled, pointing to the way Helen had carefully cleaned the food container before handing it back. "Only mothers know to do that. Only mothers think about making work easier for other women." She paused, studying Helen's face. "How long since you've seen your baby?" 32 years, Helen whispered. "They took him when he was 6 weeks old. Said I wasn't good enough." "Ay, Dios mío." Maria crossed herself, her eyes filling with the tears of someone who understood maternal loss. What was his name? Jason Morrison Foster. They changed his last name when they gave him to better people. Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the careful attention of someone who understood that every detail mattered. "You never stopped looking for him." "I tried everything. But when you're poor, when you don't have lawyers or connections, the system isn't made for people like us." Helen's voice broke. "He probably thinks I abandoned him. Probably thinks I didn't care." From that day forward, Maria became Helen's lifeline to hope. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would stop with food, with conversation, with the radical gift of treating Helen like a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. She brought news from the world Helen had been exiled from, stories about her grandson's soccer games, her daughter's nursing school struggles, the families she worked for who had problems money couldn't solve. But more importantly, Maria brought something Helen had given up on: active help. "I work for this family, the Andersons," Maria said one Thursday morning, her voice carrying unusual excitement. "Been cleaning their house for 8 years. They got connections all over Chicago, lawyers, judges, people who know people." Helen's heart stopped. "Anderson? That's the name they gave me. The family who adopted Jason." Maria's eyes widened. "What's the father's name?" "The Anderson man. Richard Anderson. He was some kind of businessman. Investment banking, I think." "Mija," Maria said slowly. "Richard Anderson is my boss. Has been for 8 years." The world tilted. Helen grabbed Maria's arm, her fingers shaking. "Are you sure? Richard Anderson on Lakeshore Drive? With a wife named Catherine?" "Catherine died 2 years ago. Cancer." Maria's voice was gentle but certain. "But yes, same Richard Anderson, same house. And Mija, he has a son." Helen couldn't breathe. After 32 years of searching, of wondering, of hoping, her son had been within Maria's reach every week for 8 years. Is Jason still?" "Not Jason," Maria said carefully. "The son's name is Jason Foster. He don't live there no more, hasn't for maybe 10 years. But Mr. Anderson, he talks about him sometimes. Says his son is some big businessman now. Very successful." Helen felt the ground shifting beneath her. Jason Foster. He'd taken back his original last name. The name from her marriage certificate. The name that connected him to her. "Does Mr. Anderson does he seem happy about his son?" Maria's expression grew complicated. "He's proud, yes, but also sad, I think. Sometimes I see him looking at old pictures. Sometimes he asks me if I think Jason will call." She paused. "I think maybe things are not so good between them. Like maybe Jason found out something that made him angry." The possibility that Jason might have learned the truth about his adoption sent electricity through Helen's exhausted body. Could he be looking for her too? Could the love she'd never stopped feeling be mutual after all these years? But Maria wasn't finished with her revelations. "Mija, there's something else. Mr. Anderson, he's been sick. Real sick. Last month he asked me to help him go through old papers in his study, legal documents, adoption records, stuff like that. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I saw your name, Helen. On the papers. Your signature. Helen's hands flew to her mouth. He kept them? After all these years? Not just kept them. He was, how do you say, organizing them. Like maybe he wanted to give them to someone. Like maybe he was getting ready to tell the truth. Maria reached into her purse and pulled out a piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. This is where Jason lives now. I asked around, talked to the mailman who used to deliver to Mr. Anderson's house. He remembers Jason, knows where he moved. Helen stared at the address, an apartment building in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's most expensive neighborhoods. Her son lived 3 miles away. 3 miles that might as well have been 3 million, given the vast gulf between their circumstances. I can't, Helen said, panic rising in her throat. Look at me, Maria. I can't show up at his door like this. He'll see what I've become and know they were right to take him away. Maria stood up, her small frame radiating determination. Listen to me, Mija. I've been working for rich people for 20 years. You know what I learned? Money don't make you a good person. Having nice things don't make you a good mother. She knelt down until she was at Helen's eye level. You think about that boy every day for 32 years. You saved money for him when you had nothing. You worked in hospitals taking care of other people's children because you couldn't take care of your own. That's love, Helen. That's the kind of love he's been missing. But Helen was shaking her head, overwhelmed by the impossibility of bridging such different worlds. He's successful, Maria. He has a life. What if I ruin it? What if seeing me destroys everything he's built? And what if not seeing you is what's been destroying him? Maria countered. What if he's been looking for his real mother his whole life, and all this time she's been 3 miles away thinking she's not good enough? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria's bus, its diesel engine rumbling impatiently at the curb. But before boarding, Maria pressed the address more firmly into Helen's hand. I'm going to help you, Mija. We're going to find a way. She squeezed Helen's fingers around the paper. That boy needs his mother, and you need your son. Rich or poor, fancy or simple, family is family. As the bus pulled away, Helen looked down at the address that represented her son's life without her. Jason Foster, 1247 North Cleveland Avenue, apartment 4B. She had his name, his address, his proximity. What she didn't have was courage. But for the first time in years, Helen Morrison had something more precious than courage. She had an ally who believed she deserved to be found. The decision to walk to Jason's address came not from courage, but from desperation. Helen had been carrying the piece of paper for 3 days, reading and rereading 1247 North Cleveland Avenue, apartment 4B, until the ink began to smudge from her nervous touching. Maria wouldn't be back until Thursday, and the weight of knowing Jason was so close was crushing her chest like a physical force. She told herself she wouldn't approach him. She would just look at the building where he lived, maybe catch a glimpse of the man her baby had become. Just seeing him from a distance might be enough to quiet the 32-year ache in her heart, or at least prove to herself that he was real, that he was thriving, that giving him up had been worth the cost. The walk from downtown to Lincoln Park took 2 hours. Helen's worn shoes weren't designed for such distances, and by the time she reached the tree-lined streets of one of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods, her feet were bleeding inside her socks. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional overwhelm of seeing how Jason lived. The building at 1247 North Cleveland was a converted Victorian mansion, its red brick facade restored to pristine condition, with brass fixtures that gleamed in the afternoon sun. A doorman in a crisp uniform stood behind glass doors that probably cost more than most people's cars. Helen realized with crushing clarity that this wasn't just wealth. This was a level of success that put Jason in a completely different universe from hers. She positioned herself across the street, partially hidden behind a mature oak tree, and waited. For what, she wasn't sure. Maybe just proof that he existed. Maybe the courage to cross the street and ring his bell. Maybe a sign from the universe that she deserved to disrupt his perfect life with her broken one. The first person to emerge from the building was a woman in her 30s, designer heels clicking against the sidewalk as she spoke into a phone about wine selections for a dinner party. Not Jason. Then an elderly man walking a dog that wore a collar more expensive than Helen's entire wardrobe. Still not Jason. Helen was about to give up, her legs shaking from exhaustion and her heart breaking from the impossibility of her situation, when the brass doors opened and a man stepped out. Tall, blonde hair that caught the sunlight the same way it had when he was 6 weeks old. The same nose she remembered tracing with her finger during those precious early mornings when the world was quiet, and Jason was hers alone. 32 years older, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she'd earned in the last 6 months, but unmistakably her son. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Jason looked exactly like his father, the husband she'd lost in that construction accident all those years ago. But he moved with a confidence that his father had never possessed, the easy assurance of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. He was talking on his phone, his voice carrying across the street with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Tell Morrison Industries we need those projections by Friday, or we're looking at other suppliers." Morrison Industries. He was using his original name professionally, the name that connected him to her. Helen took an involuntary step toward the street, her maternal instincts overriding 32 years of separation. This was her baby, her son, the child she'd held and loved and grieved for every single day since losing him. But as Jason climbed into a sleek black BMW, Helen caught sight of her reflection in a storefront window. Wild grey hair that hadn't been properly cut in months, clothes that marked her as homeless from 50 feet away, skin weathered by years of sleeping outside. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who'd been discarded by society, someone who belonged in shelters and soup kitchens rather than on tree-lined streets where doormen protected residents from people like her. The BMW pulled away from the curb, Jason still on his phone, completely unaware that his mother had been watching him from behind a tree like some kind of stalker. Helen sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the distance between their realities. How could she possibly approach him? How could she explain that the successful businessman with the expensive car and the luxury apartment had been born to a woman who now begged for coins? How could she prove that the love she'd carried for 32 years was worth disrupting the life he'd built without her? But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Helen was still sitting on the bench, gathering strength for the long walk back downtown, when Jason's BMW pulled back onto the street. He'd forgotten something, apparently, because he was walking quickly toward the building's entrance, no longer on his phone, his expression focused and slightly annoyed. That's when he saw her. Jason stopped mid-stride, his eyes fixed on the woman sitting alone on the bench across from his building. Something about her posture, or maybe the way she held her head, caught his attention in a way that made him pause rather than continue into his building. For a moment that stretched like eternity, mother and son looked at each other across 30 feet of sidewalk and 32 years of separation. Neither moved, neither spoke, but something electric passed between them, a recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with blood calling to blood. Jason began walking toward her, slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal. His business-trained mind was processing details, the woman's age, her obvious poverty, the way she seemed both familiar and impossible, but his heart was racing with a possibility so enormous he was afraid to name it. Helen watched him approach and felt her world tilt on its axis. This was happening. After 32 years of wondering and hoping and grieving, this moment was actually happening. She wanted to run, to disappear before she could destroy his perfect life with her broken one. But her legs wouldn't move and Jason was getting closer. "Excuse me," he said when he was close enough to speak without shouting. His voice was gentle but uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but do we know each other? There's something about you that seems—" Helen's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, to the photograph she'd carried for 32 years. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out and held it toward him without speaking. Jason took the photograph, and Helen watched his face transform as he studied the image. She saw the exact moment when recognition hit, his eyes widening, his mouth opening slightly, his hand beginning to shake as he held the faded picture of a young woman holding a baby. "This is," he whispered, looking from the photograph to Helen's face and back again. "This can't be. Your name is Jason Morrison Foster," Helen said, her voice barely audible. "You were born on March 15, 1992, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. You weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. You had a birthmark on your left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon." Jason staggered backward as if he'd been hit. "How do you know that? How do you—" He stopped, staring at her with growing recognition. "The birthmark. Nobody knows about the birthmark. The Andersons never mentioned it because they wanted to forget everything about—" About me, Helen finished quietly. About your real mother. The word mother hung in the air between them like a prayer and a curse. Jason sank onto the bench beside her, still gripping the photograph, his successful businessman composure completely shattered. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "For 2 years, ever since Richard Anderson told me the truth, ever since he admitted that you didn't abandon me, that they took me from you." Helen's heart stopped. "He told you? He was dying, cancer. He said he couldn't go to his grave carrying the lie." Jason's hands were shaking as he spoke. "He said you loved me. He said you fought for me. He said they convinced you that giving me up was the only way to save me from a life of poverty." Tears were streaming down Helen's face now. 32 years of grief and relief and desperate love pouring out at once. "I never wanted to give you up. I held you for 6 weeks, and every day I thought they might change their minds, might let me keep you. When they made me sign those papers, I thought I was going to die." Jason turned to face her fully, studying every line of her face as if trying to memorize her features. "I hired private investigators. I searched adoption records. I've been to every Helen Morrison in the Chicago area, and none of them were you." His voice broke. "I never thought to look on the streets," Helen whispered. "You never thought to look among the homeless." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 32 years of separation and the terrible irony that they'd been living 3 miles apart while Jason searched the world for her. "I'm sorry," Helen said finally, gesturing to her appearance, her circumstances. "I'm sorry you found me like this. I wanted to be someone you could be proud of. I wanted to prove that they were wrong about me, that I could have been a good mother if they'd given me the chance." Jason reached out slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, and took her weathered hand in his manicured one. "You were a good mother. You are a good mother. You loved me enough to let me go when you thought it would save me, and you never stopped looking for me, even when the world threw you away." He pulled out his own phone and showed her his wallpaper, the same photograph she'd been carrying but professionally restored, the colors bright and clear. "I've carried this picture every day for 2 years. Richard gave it to me when he confessed. It's been my reminder that somewhere out there my real mother was thinking about me too." Helen stared at the phone, at the image of herself as a young mother, visible on the screen of her successful son's expensive device. "I kept my picture. I kept everything he gave me. Birth certificate, hospital records, your signature on the adoption papers." Jason's voice was thick with emotion. "I wanted to understand what kind of woman could love a child so much that she'd sacrifice her own happiness for his future." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Jason's phone ringing. He glanced at the screen and immediately declined the call. "That was my office. I was supposed to be in a meeting 5 minutes ago." He looked at Helen with fierce determination. "I don't care. They can wait. Everyone can wait. I just found my mother." In that silence, something inside Helen cracked. But it wasn't weakness. It was the beginning of truth. After 32 years of carrying shame and loss, she was finally looking into the eyes of the child she'd never stopped loving, and he was looking back with recognition, with acceptance, with love. The ride in Jason's BMW felt like traveling between planets. Helen sat in the passenger seat, afraid to touch anything, hyper-aware of how out of place she looked in the pristine interior that smelled of expensive leather and success. Her reflection in the window showed a homeless woman being driven through Chicago's wealthiest neighborhoods, and the cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. "I can't," she said suddenly, as Jason turned onto Lakeshore Drive. "I can't go to your apartment. Look at me, Jason. I don't belong in your world." Jason pulled over immediately, parking along the lakefront where the November wind sent waves crashing against the shore. He turned to face her, his eyes still red from crying. "You don't understand. There is no my world without you in it. There never has been." But Helen was shaking her head, panic rising in her throat. "You have a life, a career, people who respect you. What happens when they find out your mother is—" She gestured helplessly at herself. "When they see what you came from, then they'll see that I came from love," Jason said firmly. "They'll see that my mother is the strongest person I've ever met." He reached across the console and took her trembling hand. "Do you know what Richard Anderson told me before he died? He said you were the only person who ever scared him." Helen looked up, confused. "Scared him? Because you never stopped fighting for me. Even after you signed the papers, even when the lawyers told you the adoption was final, you kept showing up at their house. You kept calling. You kept believing that love was stronger than law." Jason's voice grew stronger as he spoke. He said Catherine, my adoptive mother, used to have nightmares that you'd somehow prove they were wrong, that a court would give me back to you because you loved me more than they ever could. They told me if I contacted you again, they'd have me arrested for harassment. They lied, just like they lied about everything else. Jason's jaw tightened with anger that had been building for 2 years. They told me you were a drug addict who abandoned me. They told me you'd signed papers saying you never wanted to see me again. They built their entire relationship with me on lies about you. Helen felt something shift inside her chest. Not the familiar ache of loss, but something harder, more defiant. Why did Richard finally tell you the truth? Because he was dying, and he couldn't face judgment with that lie on his conscience. And because... Jason paused, gathering courage for the next revelation. Because I'd already started to suspect something was wrong. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos until he found what he was looking for. This is from my college graduation. The image showed a younger Jason in cap and gown, standing between Richard and Catherine Anderson. But his smile looked forced, hollow. Look at my eyes. Everyone said I should be happy. Full scholarship to Northwestern, job offers from 3 different investment firms. But I felt empty. Helen studied the photo, seeing the sadness her son had carried despite his achievements. You weren't happy. I was successful. There's a difference. Jason swiped to the next photo. This is from my wedding 3 years ago. Helen's heart clenched at the sight of Jason in a tuxedo, standing beside a beautiful woman in white. They looked perfect together. Young, wealthy, the kind of couple featured in society magazines. But again, something was missing from Jason's expression. She's beautiful, Helen managed. She was, and ambitious, and completely uninterested in having a husband who woke up screaming from nightmares about a woman he couldn't remember but couldn't forget. Jason's voice turned bitter. Amanda left me 18 months ago, said I was emotionally unavailable, and that she couldn't compete with a ghost. Oh, Jason, I'm sorry. Don't be, she was right. I was emotionally unavailable. How could I love someone else when I didn't even know who I was? When every achievement felt hollow because the person I most wanted to share it with was a stranger. Jason scrolled to more photos. Professional headshots, corporate events, charity galas, where he mingled with Chicago's elite. In every image he looked successful and completely alone. I had everything the Andersons promised me. Private schools, Ivy League education, connections that opened every door. But none of it mattered because the most important connection, the one to you, had been severed. He looked directly at Helen. Do you know what the breaking point was? What made me demand the truth from Richard? Helen shook her head. 2 years ago, I was at a company retreat, team-building exercise where we had to share our earliest memory. Everyone else talked about birthday parties, family vacations, Christmas mornings, and his voice broke slightly. I talked about a lullaby. A woman's voice singing to me in the dark, something about sunshine and moonbeams. Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You remember that? Barely. Like an echo, but it was the only real memory I had from before the Andersons. Everyone laughed, said babies don't remember songs. But I knew it was real because it was the only memory that made me feel safe. Jason's eyes filled with tears again. That was you, wasn't it? You sang to me. Every night, Helen whispered. For 6 weeks every night. You are my sunshine and blue moon, and little songs I made up just for you. She was crying again, overwhelmed by the knowledge that something of their bond had survived all these years. I went straight to Richard after that retreat and demanded the truth. He tried to deflect, to maintain the story they'd told me, but I threatened to cut him out of my life completely if he didn't tell me what really happened. Jason laughed bitterly. Ironic, isn't it? The only power I had over him was the threat to leave, when leaving was exactly what they'd forced you to do. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the waves crash against the shoreline. Then Jason spoke again, his voice quiet but determined. I need you to understand something. Everything I achieved, every success they're so proud of, it was all motivated by the hope that someday I'd be worthy of finding you again. Helen turned to stare at him. What do you mean? I worked twice as hard as anyone else because I thought maybe if I became successful enough, important enough, I could hire the best investigators, access the best resources. I thought maybe wealth could buy me what the Andersons had stolen, a relationship with my real mother. The weight of this revelation settled over Helen like a blanket. Her son's entire life had been shaped by losing her, just as hers had been shaped by losing him. They'd both been living with the same wound, carrying the same grief, searching for the same connection. But what if finding me ruins everything you've built? Helen asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if your colleagues, your clients, your friends see me and decide you're not the person they thought you were? Jason was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. You know what? You're probably right. Some of them will judge me. Some of them will see your homelessness as a reflection of my worth, my character, my fitness to handle their money. Helen's heart sank. And those people, Jason continued, are exactly the kind of people I don't want in my life anymore. If someone can't see that my mother's circumstances don't define her value or mine, then they don't deserve my respect or my business. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it in Helen's weathered hands. The card was simple, elegant. Jason Morrison Foster, financial consultant. But it was the business name that made Helen's breath catch. Morrison Family Investments. I changed the company name 6 months ago, Jason explained. I wanted to honor the name I was born with, the name that connects me to you. My clients think it sounds more established, more trustworthy. They have no idea it's really a promise I made to a mother I was determined to find. Helen stared at the card, seeing her maiden name printed in raised lettering. You built a company named after me? I built everything with you in mind. The charitable foundation that provides microloans to single mothers? That's because of you. The scholarship program for kids aging out of foster care. That's because I understand what it feels like to be cut off from your roots. Jason's voice grew stronger with each word. Every decision I've made in business has been filtered through one question: what would make my real mother proud? But Jason, I don't understand business. I don't know anything about investments or finance. You know about sacrifice. You know about putting someone else's needs before your own. You know about fighting for what's right even when the system is stacked against you. Jason turned to face her fully. Those are the values that built my company. Those are the principles that made me successful. I learned them from you in 6 weeks, and they've guided me for 32 years. Helen felt something fundamental shifting inside her. The same cracking sensation she'd experienced on the bench, but deeper now, more complete. For 32 years she'd carried the shame of being deemed unfit, of being told she wasn't good enough to raise her own child. But sitting in this car, looking at the business card that bore her name, listening to her son explain how her love had shaped his entire life, she began to understand a truth that changed everything. She hadn't failed as a mother. She'd been robbed of the chance to mother. There was a difference, and that difference mattered. I want to go to your apartment, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I want to see how my son lives. I want to hear about your business, your dreams, everything I missed. She looked down at her torn clothes, her dirty hands. But first, I need to clean up. I need to look like someone worthy of being your mother. Jason smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. You already look like someone worthy of being my mother. You look like someone who survived 32 years of hell and still had enough love left to give it all to her son the moment she found him again. As they drove toward downtown Chicago, Helen Morrison began to understand that coming home wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about finally being allowed to be who she'd always been underneath the circumstances that had tried to define her. Jason's mother, fierce and loving and unbroken despite everything the world had thrown at her. The real transformation wasn't going to be changing how she looked or where she lived. It was going to be learning to see herself through her son's eyes, instead of through the eyes of a society that had thrown her away. 3 months later, Helen Morrison stood in front of the bathroom mirror in Jason's guest bedroom and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a careful, patient process of healing that went far deeper than new clothes or a proper haircut. Her hair, now professionally styled and colored to cover the gray that had made her look older than her 73 years, framed a face that had regained some of its former softness. The deep lines etched by years of hunger and stress were still there, but they were accompanied now by something that had been missing for decades: hope. She wore a simple blue dress that Jason had insisted on buying for her. Nothing too expensive or flashy, just something that fit properly and made her feel like a person rather than a problem to be managed. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who belonged in polite society, someone who had a right to take up space in the world. But the real change wasn't visible in the mirror. The real change was in how Helen carried herself, how she spoke, how she moved through the world with a quiet dignity that no amount of poverty had ever been able to permanently destroy. The first month living with Jason had been the hardest. Not because he wasn't kind. He was endlessly patient, gentle and generous. But because Helen had spent 4 years learning to make herself invisible, and suddenly being seen, being cared for, being treated as if her comfort mattered, felt overwhelming. "I don't have to ask permission to eat food from the refrigerator," Jason had said during her second week, finding her standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m., clearly hungry but afraid to take anything without explicit invitation. "This is your home now. Everything here is yours as much as it's mine." It had taken weeks for Helen to believe that. Weeks of Jason gently insisting that she didn't need to clean his apartment to earn her keep, that she didn't need to make herself useful to justify taking up space. Weeks of him coming home from work and asking about her day, as if her thoughts and experiences mattered. "I hired someone to deep clean the apartment," Jason had announced one evening, noticing Helen obsessively scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless. "I can clean," Helen had protested. "I'm good at cleaning. I don't mind." "I know you're good at it, but you're not here to be my housekeeper, you're here to be my mother." Jason had sat down beside her, taking the sponge from her hands. "I want to hear your stories. I want to know what you think about books, about music, about the world. I want to learn who you are when you're not just surviving." That conversation had marked a turning point. Slowly, tentatively, Helen began to remember who she had been before homelessness had stripped away everything, except the most basic functions of survival. She started reading again, real books from Jason's extensive library, not just discarded newspapers. She discovered that she enjoyed documentaries about history, that she had opinions about politics, that she could still laugh at comedies even after years of forgetting what humor felt like. Jason enrolled her in a beginner's computer class at the local library, understanding that part of rejoining society meant learning to navigate technologies that had evolved while she'd been excluded from normal life. Helen's instructor, a patient young woman named Sarah, never made her feel foolish for not knowing how to use email or search the internet. "You're picking this up faster than most people your age," Sarah had told her during the 4th lesson. "You must have been good with details in your previous work." Previous work. The phrase had made Helen realize that she was beginning to think of her homelessness as something that had happened to her rather than something that defined her. She was Helen Morrison, former hospital custodian, former caring member of society. Not just Helen, the homeless woman who used to beg on street corners. The most difficult challenge had been medical care. Years of sleeping outside, of inadequate nutrition, of stress that had worn down her body's defenses, had left Helen with health problems that required immediate attention. Jason had taken her to his personal physician, Dr. Andrews, who had treated her with the same respect he showed his wealthiest patients. "Your mother has remarkable resilience," Dr. Andrews had told Jason after Helen's comprehensive physical exam. "Arthritis, some dental issues that need addressing, signs of previous malnutrition, but nothing that can't be treated. She's tougher than she looks." The dental work had been particularly transformative. Helen hadn't realized how much her missing teeth had affected not just her appearance, but her willingness to speak, to smile, to engage with others. When the dental implants were complete, she'd spent an hour in Jason's bathroom, just practicing smiling at herself in the mirror. But the most profound change came from an unexpected source, Maria Santos. Jason had insisted on meeting the woman who had connected him to his mother, and the three of them had shared dinner at a quiet restaurant where Maria could tell her side of the story. Helen had watched, amazed, as her son treated Maria with the same respect he showed his business colleagues, asking about her family, her work, her dreams for the future. "Your boy has good manners," Maria had told Helen when Jason stepped away to take a business call. "Rich people, they usually don't see housekeepers as real people, but he asks about my grandson's soccer games. He remembers my daughter's name. He learned that from you," Helen had replied, surprising herself with the insight. "You showed him that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued. When you stopped for me on that corner, you taught him what real kindness looks like." The conversation had sparked an idea that would change everything. "I want to do something," Helen had told Jason the next morning. "Something meaningful. I've spent 4 years being helped, being served, being treated as someone who only takes from the world. I want to give something back." Jason had looked up from his coffee, instantly attentive. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to work with homeless women, older women especially. I know what it's like to be invisible, to be treated like garbage. I know which shelters are safe, which soup kitchens serve real food, which social workers actually care, and which ones are just collecting paychecks." Helen's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I want to be for them what Maria was for me, someone who sees them as human beings instead of problems. Jason had smiled, that same genuine smile that had appeared when she'd first agreed to come to his apartment. I think that's the most beautiful idea I've ever heard. Within 2 weeks, Jason had used his business connections to set up meetings with 3 different charitable organizations that served Chicago's homeless population. But Helen had surprised him by rejecting all 3 proposals. They want to put me on a board, make me a spokesperson, she'd explained. They want to use my story to raise money from rich people who feel guilty about inequality. That's not what I want to do. Then what do you want to do? I want to work directly with the women one-on-one, the way Maria worked with me. Helen had pulled out a notebook where she'd been writing ideas. I want to go to the corners where they sit, the shelters where they sleep, the places where they feel safe. I want to bring them food, yes, but also conversation, dignity, the knowledge that someone sees them as more than their circumstances. Jason had stared at his mother with something approaching awe. You want to go back to the streets? Not to live there, to serve there, there's a difference. Helen had looked out the window of Jason's apartment toward the downtown area, where she'd spent 4 years learning to be invisible. I survived that hell for a reason. Maybe this is it. They'd started small. Every Saturday morning, Helen and Jason would load his BMW with sandwiches, coffee, and warm clothes, driving to the corners and alleyways where Chicago's forgotten women tried to survive. Helen knew exactly where to find them, because she'd been one of them. The first woman they approached was suspicious, defensive, the way Helen had been when Maria first offered help. But something in Helen's manner, in the way she sat down beside the woman instead of standing over her, in the way she said, I know how cold it gets at night, instead of, how can I help you? Something convinced the woman that this wasn't another social worker or charity volunteer, treating homelessness as an abstract problem to be solved. You been out here? The woman had asked, studying Helen's clean clothes, but recognizing something familiar in her eyes. 4 years, Helen had replied simply. Slept in doorways, begged for coins, ate from dumpsters. This is my son, he found me 3 months ago. The conversation that followed had lasted 2 hours. By the end, the woman, whose name was Dorothy and who'd been on the streets for 6 years since losing her job as a school cafeteria worker, had accepted not just food and warm socks, but something more precious. The knowledge that her situation wasn't permanent, that someone who understood her circumstances believed she was worth saving. Word spread quickly through the informal networks that connected Chicago's homeless women. Every Saturday brought new faces, women who'd heard that Helen Morrison understood their lives because she'd lived them. They trusted her in ways they couldn't trust social workers or volunteers who'd never known hunger, never felt the particular shame of being invisible in a world full of people. Jason watched his mother work and realized that everything he'd achieved in business paled in comparison to what she was accomplishing on street corners and in shelter common rooms. She wasn't just helping people, she was returning their humanity to them, one conversation at a time. You know what amazes me? Jason had told her one Saturday evening as they drove home after spending the day with a group of women who'd been living in an abandoned building. You've been off the streets for 3 months, but you never talk about that time as if it's behind you. You talk about it as if it's still part of who you are. Helen had considered this observation carefully. Because it is part of who I am. Being homeless didn't make me less than human, and not being homeless doesn't make me better than the women who are still out there. It just makes me someone who has resources now. Resources I need to share. She'd paused, watching the city lights blur past the car window. For 32 years I thought losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it was terrible. It broke my heart, in ways that never fully healed. But maybe it was also necessary. Maybe I needed to understand loss and pain, and what it feels like to be discarded so that I could help other people who are experiencing those things. Jason had pulled over then, overcome by emotion. You're saying that everything you suffered, losing me, losing your home, living on the streets, you're saying it was worth it? I'm saying it wasn't meaningless, Helen had replied, reaching over to take his hand. Pain is only meaningless if we don't let it teach us how to love better. And you, my beautiful son, you turned your pain into a search for love. I'm turning mine into a way to give love to people who need it most. For the first time in 32 years, Helen Morrison went to sleep that night feeling not just loved but useful, not just rescued, but purposeful, not just someone's mother, but someone who mattered to the world in her own right. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't the transformation she'd expected. She hadn't become someone new. She'd become herself again, The woman who'd always known how to love fiercely, who'd always understood that everyone deserved dignity, who'd always believed that caring for others was the highest calling a person could answer. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women who needed to know they weren't invisible, new opportunities to turn suffering into service. But tonight, Helen Morrison was exactly where she belonged, home with her son, planning ways to make the world a little more loving for people who'd forgotten they deserved love at all. 1 year later, Helen Morrison stood at the podium of the Chicago Civic Center, looking out at an audience of 300 people who had gathered for the inaugural Helen Morrison Foundation Gala. The irony wasn't lost on her. A woman who had spent 4 years being invisible was now the center of attention in a room full of Chicago's most influential citizens. But this wasn't about her anymore. This was about the 47 women who had found permanent housing through the Foundation's programs. This was about the 18 women who had been reunited with family members they'd lost contact with during their homelessness. This was about Dorothy, who now worked as a peer counselor and had her own small apartment for the first time in 7 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jason said into the microphone, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found his purpose, "I'd like you to meet someone who changed my life completely. My mother, Helen Morrison." The applause was warm, genuine, but Helen barely heard it. She was scanning the audience for the faces that mattered most. The women she'd worked with over the past year, the ones who'd accepted the Foundation's invitation to attend this celebration not as charity cases, but as honored guests whose experiences had shaped every program the Foundation offered. There was Maria Santos in the third row, wearing a dress her daughter had bought for the occasion, beaming with pride as if Helen were her own child. There was Dorothy, whose transformation over the past year had been even more dramatic than Helen's own, and scattered throughout the audience were other women whose stories Helen carried in her heart, women who'd taught her that survival wasn't just about enduring, but about maintaining hope, even when hope seemed foolish. "A year ago," Helen began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "I was sitting on a street corner, invisible to the world, forgotten by society, convinced that my life had no value beyond the coins people might drop in my cup. I thought my story was a tragedy, a mother who'd lost her child and never recovered." She paused, finding Jason's face in the audience. He was crying again, but these were different tears than the ones he'd shed at their reunion. These were tears of pride, of completion, of a joy so deep it overflowed. "I was wrong about my story," Helen continued. "It wasn't a tragedy. It was preparation. Every year of struggle, every night of hunger, every moment of feeling worthless, all of it was preparing me for this moment, for this work, for the privilege of serving Chicago's most vulnerable women with the knowledge that comes only from lived experience." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Helen had learned to speak publicly over the past year, but her power as a speaker didn't come from training or technique. It came from absolute authenticity, from the rare gift of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore could speak only truth. "The Helen Morrison Foundation operates on a simple principle," she said. "No woman is disposable, no matter how long she's been on the streets, no matter what circumstances brought her there, no matter how many people have written her off as hopeless. Every woman deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be given a real chance at rebuilding her life." She gestured toward Dorothy, who stood up when Helen mentioned her name. Dorothy Harrison was living in an abandoned building when we met. Society saw her as a failure, a drain on resources, someone who'd made bad choices and deserved the consequences. But I saw someone who'd worked in school cafeterias for 20 years, feeding children with the same care she would have given her own grandchildren. Someone who'd lost her job not through any fault of her own, but because budget cuts eliminated her position. Someone who'd been failed by every system designed to help her. Dorothy waved at the audience, no longer the broken woman Helen had met on the streets. She was employed now, housed, reunited with a sister who'd been searching for her for 3 years. But more than that, she was proud of how far she'd come, proud of the work she was doing to help other women, proud to be introduced as someone whose life had value. "Today, Dorothy runs our peer counseling program," Helen continued. "She's helped 12 women transition from the streets to permanent housing. She's the first person they see when they come to our office, scared and desperate and convinced they're beyond help. And because Dorothy knows exactly what they're feeling, because she's lived in the same hell they're trying to escape, she can offer them something no social worker or volunteer can, proof that transformation is possible." The applause for Dorothy was thunderous. Helen waited for it to die down before continuing. But this foundation isn't just about helping homeless women. It's about changing how society sees them. It's about recognizing that homelessness is not a character flaw, but a housing crisis. It's about understanding that poverty is not a personal failure, but a systemic problem that requires systemic solutions. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, the same kind of notebook paper she'd used to plan their first Saturday outreach visits. This foundation has placed 47 women in permanent housing this year, but we've also changed 47 minds in this room tonight. 47 people who might have walked past a homeless woman yesterday will stop tomorrow and see a human being with a story worth hearing. Jason stood up from his seat and joined his mother at the podium. Before I found my mother, I thought success meant accumulating wealth and status. I thought helping people meant writing checks to charities and attending fundraising galas. I never understood that real change happens one relationship at a time, one conversation at a time, one person choosing to see another person's humanity. He turned to face Helen. My mother taught me that the measure of a life isn't what you achieve for yourself, but what you make possible for others. She taught me that the most powerful people aren't those with the most resources, but those with the most compassion. Helen felt the familiar crack in her chest, not the breaking of pain this time, but the expansion of joy. My son taught me something equally important, she said to the audience. He taught me that love doesn't diminish over time or distance, that a mother's love and a child's love can survive 32 years of separation and emerge stronger than ever. He taught me that finding each other again wasn't the end of our story, it was the beginning. The evening's program continued with testimonials from other women the foundation had helped, with presentations about future programs, with the announcement that 3 other cities were implementing similar models based on Chicago's success. But the real magic happened during the reception, when the artificial barriers between donors and beneficiaries dissolved into genuine human connection. Helen watched a wealthy businessman deep in conversation with a formerly homeless woman who was sharing her expertise about the challenges of finding employment without a permanent address. She saw Maria translating for a Spanish-speaking woman who was describing her job training program to a potential employer. She saw Dorothy explaining the importance of trauma-informed care to a group of social workers who had never considered how their approach might re-traumatize people they were trying to help. This was what Helen had dreamed of during those long nights on the streets. Not just being rescued herself, but being part of something that changed how society treated its most vulnerable members. The foundation wasn't just providing services, it was building bridges between worlds that had been kept artificially separate. As the evening wound down, Helen found herself standing with Jason on the balcony of the Civic Center, looking out over the city where they'd both been lost and found. "Do you ever regret it?" Jason asked quietly. "The 32 years we lost, the life we might have had together if things had been different?" Helen considered the question carefully. It was one she'd asked herself many times over the past year, especially during moments when the grief of all that lost time threatened to overwhelm her gratitude for their reunion. "I regret the system that separated us," she said finally. "I regret the lies they told us both. I regret the years of pain we both carried unnecessarily." She paused, watching the city lights twinkle below them. "But I don't regret who we became because of that pain. You became someone who uses success to lift others up. I became someone who can offer hope to people who've lost everything. Our suffering wasn't meaningless if we transform it into service." Jason nodded, understanding flooding his face. "You're saying we're better people now than we would have been if we'd never been separated?" "I'm saying we're exactly the people we needed to become to do this work," Helen replied. "And this work, helping people, changing lives, building bridges, this feels like why we found each other again. Not just to heal our own wounds, but to use our healing to help others heal theirs." 3 months later, Helen received a letter that brought the story full circle in a way she'd never imagined possible. The return address was from Richard Anderson's estate attorney, and inside was a handwritten note from Richard himself, written just before his death, but only now being delivered according to his instructions. "Dear Helen," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means Jason found you and my lawyer followed my instructions to track you down through him. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive a dying man's attempt at redemption. I've carried the guilt of what Catherine and I did to you for 32 years. We convinced ourselves we were saving Jason from poverty, but the truth is, we were stealing him because we wanted him, and we had the power to take him. We destroyed your family to build ours, and there's no justification for that cruelty. Jason grew up to be an extraordinary man despite our lies, not because of them. Every good thing about him, his compassion, his drive to help others, his capacity for love, came from the 6 weeks he spent with you, not from the 32 years he spent with us. I'm leaving half my estate to a fund Jason can use however he thinks you would want. Use it to build something beautiful. Use it to help other mothers who've been told they're not good enough. Use it to prove that love is stronger than law, that justice can win even when it takes 32 years. Thank you for loving my son when I couldn't. Thank you for making him the man I was never worthy of calling my own. Richard Anderson. The estate was worth $2.3 million. Helen stared at the number until it lost all meaning, then called Jason to share the news. What do you want to do with it? He asked after reading the letter himself. Helen smiled, already knowing the answer. I want to build a place where mothers and children can stay together while they get back on their feet. A place where families don't have to choose between safety and staying together. A place where love is stronger than circumstances. And that's exactly what they did. 2 years later, the Morrison Family Center opened its doors in a renovated building on the south side of Chicago. It wasn't a shelter in the traditional sense. It was a transitional housing facility where mothers and children could live together for up to 18 months while receiving job training, childcare, counseling, and all the support services needed to build stable, independent lives. Helen Morrison, now 76 years old and recognized as one of Chicago's most effective advocates for homeless families, cut the ribbon with her son beside her and Dorothy serving as the center's first program director. The building was full of light, full of hope, full of families who were no longer being told that staying together was impossible. Have you ever felt invisible, forgotten, or told you weren't enough? Have you known someone whose love seemed worthless to the world, but meant everything to the people who received it? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps spread this message of hope to others who need to hear it. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching.